The gender pay gap in the United States is the ratio of female to male median yearly earnings among full-time, year-round workers. The average female's unadjusted annual salary has been cited as 78% to 82% of that of the average male. However, multiple studies from OECD, AAUW, and the U.S. Department of Labor have found that pay rates between males and females varied by 5 to 6.6%, or females earning 94 cents to every dollar earned by the male counterparts, when wages were adjusted for different individual choices made by male and female workers in college, major occupation, working hours, and maternal, paternal leave. The remaining 6% of the gap has been speculated to originate from deficiency in salary negotiation skills and gender discrimination. The extent to which discrimination plays a role in explaining gender wage disparities is somewhat difficult to quantify, due to a number of potentially confounding variables. A 2010 research review by the majority staff of the United States Congress Joint Economic Committee reported that studies have consistently found unexplained pay differences even after controlling for measurable factors that are assumed to influence earnings, suggestive of unknown, unmeasurable contributing factors of which gender discrimination may be one. Other studies have found direct evidence of discrimination. For example, more jobs went to women when the applicant's sex was unknown during the hiring process. Statistics. Women's median yearly earnings relative to men's rose rapidly from 1980 to 1990, and less rapidly from 1990 to 2000 and from 2000 to 2009. By state in 2007, women's earnings were lower than men's earnings in all states and the District of Columbia, according to the Income, Earnings, and Poverty data from the 2007 American Community Survey by the Census Bureau. The national female-to-male earnings ratio was 77.5%. In the South, 5 states and the District of Columbia had ratios higher than the national ratio, as did 3 states in the West. 2 states in the Northeast had ratios higher than the national ratio. There were no states in the Midwest that had ratios higher than the national ratio. As a result, women's earnings were closer to men's in more states in the South and the West than in the Northeast and the Midwest, according to an analysis of Census Bureau data released by Reach Advisors in 2008. Single childless women between ages 22 and 30 were earning more than the male counterparts in most United States cities, with incomes that were 8% greater than males on average. This shift is driven by the growing ranks of women who attend colleges and move on to high-earning jobs. By industry and occupation, women's median weekly earnings were lower than men's median weekly earnings in all industries in 2009. The industry with the largest gender pay gap was financial activities. Median weekly earnings of women employed in financial activities were 70.5% of men's median weekly earnings in that industry. Construction was the industry with the smallest gender pay gap, with women earning 92.2% of what men earned. In 2009, women's weekly median earnings were higher than men's in only 4 of the 108 occupations for which sufficient data were available to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The 4 occupations with higher weekly median earnings for women than men were other life, physical and social science technicians, bakers, teacher assistants, and dining room and cafeteria attendants and bartender helpers. The 4 largest gender wage gaps were found in well-paying occupations such as physicians and surgeons, securities, commodities and financial services, sales agents, financial managers, and other business operations specialists. Men's and fathers' rights activist Warren Farrell stated that there were at least 39 jobs where women earned at least 5% more than men. He stated the higher pay for women over men ranged from a high of 43% higher pay for female sales engineers over the male counterparts, to a 5% higher pay for female advertising and promotions managers over the male counterparts. The BLS report highlights in women's earnings in 2003 showed that there were only 2 occupations in 2003 where women's median weekly earnings exceeded men's. The 2 occupations were packers and packages, hand and health diagnosing and treating practitioner support technicians. In 2009, Bloomberg News reported that the 16 women heading companies in the Standard & Poor's 500 index averaged earnings of $14.2 million in the latest fiscal years, 43% more than the male average. Bloomberg News also found that of the people who were S&P 500 CEOs in 2008, women got a 19% raise in 2009 while men took a 5% cut. Several studies of women in the legal profession reveal persistent gaps in partnership numbers at major American law firms. Despite the fact that women have graduated from law schools in equal numbers for over 20 years, only 16 to 19% of law firm partners are women. On August 26, 2016, USA Today reported that the Hollywood gender pay gap is wider than that for average working women, and that it is worse for older women stars. By education, while greater education increases women's overall earnings, education does not close the gender pay gap. Women earn less than men at all educational levels, and the gender pay gap widens for persons with advanced degrees compared to people with high school education. In 2006, female high school graduates earned 69% of what the male counterparts earn, but women's earnings dropped to 66% of men's for those with advanced bachelor's degrees or more. By age, the earnings difference between women and men varies with age, with younger women more closely approaching pay equity than older women. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that, in 2013, female full-time workers had median weekly earnings of $706, compared to men's median weekly earnings of $860. Women aged 35 years and older earn 74 to 80% of the earnings of the male counterparts. Among younger workers, the earning differences between women and men were smaller, with women aged 16 to 24 earning 88.3% of men's earnings in the same age group, according to Andrew Beveridge, a professor of sociology at Queens College. Between 2000 and 2005, young women in the 20s earned more than the male counterparts in some large urban centers, including Dallas, New York, Chicago, Boston, and Minneapolis. A major reason for this is that women have been graduating from college in larger numbers than men, and that many of those women seem to be gravitating toward major urban areas. In 2005, 53% of women in the 20s working in New York were college graduates, compared with only 38% of men of that age. Nationwide, the wages of that group of women averaged 89% of the average full-time pay for men between 2000 and 2005. Explaining the gender pay gap. Any given raw wage gap can be decomposed into an explained part, due to differences in characteristics such as education, hours worked, work experience, and occupation, and or an unexplained part, which is typically attributed to discrimination. This may be further explained when America takes into account that men are more likely to negotiate for higher pay. According to a study by Carnegie Mellon, while negotiating for pay, 83% of men instead of only 58% of women negotiated for a higher wage. Researchers say that women who do request either a raise or a higher starting salary are more likely than men to be penalized for those actions. Cornell University economists Francine Blau and Lawrence Kahn stated that while the overall size of the wage gap has decreased somewhat over time, the proportion of the gap that is unexplained by human capital variables is increasing. Using current population survey data for 1979 and 1995 and controlling for education, experience, personal characteristics, parental status, city and region, occupation, industry, government employment, and part-time status, Yale University economics professor Joseph G. Alton G. and the United States Secretary of Commerce Rebecca M. Blank found that only about 27% of the gender wage gap in each year is explained by differences in such characteristics. A study of graduates of the University of Michigan Law School between 1972 and 1975 examined the gender wage gap while matching men and women for possible explanatory factors such as occupation, age, experience, education, time in the workforce, child care, average hours worked, grades while in college, and other factors. After accounting for all that, women were paid 81.5% of what men with similar demographic characteristics, family situations, work hours, and work experience were paid. Similarly, a comprehensive study by the staff of the U.S. Government Accountability Office found that the gender wage gap can only be partially explained by human capital factors and work patterns. The Gao study, released in 2003, was based on data from 1983 through 2000 from a representative sample of Americans between the ages of 25 and 65. The researchers controlled for work patterns, including years of work experience, education, and hours of work per year, as well as differences in industry, occupation, race, marital status, and job tenure. With controls for these variables in place, the data showed that women earned, on average, 20% less than men during the entire period 1983 to 2000. In a subsequent study, Gao found that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and the Department of Labor should better monitor the performance in enforcing anti-discrimination laws. Using CPS data, U.S. Bureau of Labor economist Stephanie Boras and College of William and Amp Mary economics professor William R. Rogers III report that only 39% of the gender pay gap is explained in 1999, controlling for percent female, schooling, experience, region, metropolitan statistical area size, minority status, part-time employment, marital status, union, government employment, and industry. Using data from longitudinal studies conducted by the U.S. Department of Education, researchers Judy Goldberg-Day and Catherine Hill analyzed some 9,000 college graduates from 1,992-93 and more than 10,000 from 1,999-2000. The researchers controlled for a multitude of variables, including occupation, industry, hours worked per week, workplace flexibility, ability to telecommute, whether employee worked multiple jobs, months at employer, marital status, whether employee had children, and whether employee volunteered in the past year. The study found that wage inequities start early and worsen over time. The portion of the pay gap that remains unexplained after all other factors are taken into account is 5% 1 year after graduation and 12% 10 years after graduation. These unexplained gaps are evidence of discrimination, which remains a serious problem for women in the workforce. Economists Francine Blau and Lawrence Kahn took a set of human capital variables such as education, labor market experience, and race into account and additionally controlled for occupation, industry, and unionism. While the gender wage gap was considerably smaller when all variables were taken into account, a substantial portion of the pay gap remained unexplained. A study by John McDowell, Larry Singel, and James Ziliak investigated faculty promotion on the economics profession and found that controlling for quality of PhD training, publishing productivity, major field of specialization, current placement in a distinguished department, age and post-PhD experience, female economists were still significantly less likely to be promoted from assistant to associate and from associate to full professor, although there was also some evidence that women's promotion opportunities from associate to full professor improved in the 1980s. Economist June O'Neill, a former director of the Congressional Budget Office, found an unexplained pay gap of 8% after controlling for experience, education, and number of years on the job. Furthermore, O'Neill found that among young people who have never had a child, women's earnings approach 98% of men's. In a stance rejecting discrimination, a 2009 study for the Department of Labor by the CONSAD Research Corporation concluded, "It is not possible now, and doubtless will never be possible, to determine reliably whether any portion of the observed gender wage gap is not attributable to factors that compensate women and men differently, on socially acceptable bases, and hence can confidently be attributed to overt discrimination against women." The conclusion was based largely on a study by Eric Solberg and AMP Teresa Laughlin, who found that occupational selection is the primary determinant of the gender wage gap because any measure of earnings that excludes fringe benefits may produce misleading results as to the existence, magnitude, consequence, and source of market discrimination. Quote, "They found that the average wage rate of females was only 87.4% of the average wage rate of males, whereas, when earnings were measured by their index of total compensation, the average value of the index for females was 96.4% of the average value for males." A 2010 study by Catalyst, a non-profit that works to expand opportunities for women in business, of male and female MBA graduates found that after controlling for career aspirations, parental status, years of experience, industry, and other variables, male graduates are more likely to be assigned jobs of higher rank and responsibility and earn, on average, $4,600 more than women in the first post-MBA jobs. Impact. Economy. An October 2012 study by the American Association of University Women found that over the course of a 35-year career, an American woman with a college degree will make about $1.2 million less than a man with the same education. Therefore, closing the pay gap by raising women's wages would have a stimulus effect that would grow the U.S. economy by at least 3% to 4%. In contrast, the $800 billion economic stimulus bill passed by Congress in 2009 is estimated to have grown the GDP by less than 1.5%. Women who paid more will likely spend that money to support themselves and their families, because so many women live in poverty. Women currently make up 70% of Medicaid recipients and 80% of welfare recipients, increasing women's workplace participation from its present rate of 76% to 84%, as it is in Sweden. The U.S. could add 5.1 million women to the workforce workforce, again, 3% to 4% of the size of the U.S. economy. Pensions. According to a report by the United States Congress Joint Economic Committee, the gender pay gap jeopardizes women's retirement security. Of the multiple sources of income Americans rely on later in life, many are directly linked to a worker's earnings over his or her career. These include Social Security benefits, based on lifetime earnings, and defined benefit pension distributions that are typically calculated using a formula based on a worker's tenure and salary during peak earnings years. The persistent gender pay gap leaves women with less income from these sources than men. For example, older women's Social Security benefits are 71% of older men's benefits. Incomes from public and private pensions based on women's own work were just 60% and 48% of men's pension incomes, respectively. Current policy solutions. In 2009, President Barack Obama signed the Lilly-led Better Fair Pay Act. This law extended the statute of limitations on cases where a worker found that they were receiving discriminatory pay, allowing them to sue and receive recompense more than 6 months after they received the pay. This was seen as a victory for those fighting against the gender wage gap, because if a woman at the end of her career found that she had been making less money than men who were doing the same work, she now had more than 6 months from the date of her last paycheck to file a claim and possibly receive the wages that were denied. Popular culture reactions. To help raise awareness on the pay gap, a pop-up store named 76 is less than 100 operated during the month of April 2015 in the Garfield neighborhood of Pittsburgh. The non-profit store, which sells arts and crafts designed by women, charges men full price while women get a 24% discount to reflect the pay gap between men and women in Pennsylvania. The operators of the store plan to operate a similar store in fall 2015 in New Orleans titled 66 is less than 100 to reflect the pay gap in Louisiana. The store made national headlines in the wake of Patricia Arquette referencing the pay gap at the 87th Academy Awards 2 months before.